On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Vanessa K. Valdés, writer, scholar, whose work focuses on the literatures, visual arts, performances, and histories of Black peoples throughout the Western Hemisphere. She served as a professor at the City College for New York for 14 years, from 2007 to 2021, earning the rank of full professor before being named the dean of the Macaulay Honors College from 21 to 22. Then returning to City College as the Associate Provost for Community Engagement. Beginning in 2025, she was named the editor of CENTRO Press, the bookmaking arm of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. She is the author of Oshun's Daughters, The Search for Womanhood in the Americas, and Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, namesake of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York. She is the editor of Let Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora, The Future Is Now, A New Look at African Diaspora Studies, Racialized Visions, Haiti and the Hispanic Caribbean, and, with Earl Fitz, Machado de Assis, Blackness and the Americas. From 2021 to 2023, along with David Pullins, she co-curated Juan de Pareja, Afro-Hispanic Painter, an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and co-authored its exhibition catalog published in 2023. With Diasporic Blackness, she began a long-standing relationship with the Schomburg Center. She currently serves on its Centennial Advisory Board and is co-editor, Barry Brown and Laura Helton, of a new book, Black Studies on 135th Street, The Founding and Future of the Schomburg Collection, coming in April 2026. In addition to her role at CENTRO Press, she is on the advisory board of Callaloo and Small Axe and is a series editor of the Afro-Latinx Future series at the State University of New York Press, and a series co-editor along with Nathan Dyes and Annette Joseph Gabriel of the Global Black Writers in Translation series at Vanderbilt University Press. You can learn more about her by visiting her website, drvkv23.com, or following her on Instagram at drvkv23. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dr. Vanessa K. Valdés, editor at CENTRO Press. How are you doing today?
I'm excited to be talking with you. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about all of the different things that you have done and are doing related to Black Studies. So how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black Studies?
So it's interesting because I was thinking about this in preparation of for this conversation. And the reality is I grew up, a Black Puerto Rican woman, girl in New York City to Black Puerto Rican parents who we had, Lerone Bennett's like before the Mayflower in the house. My parents were voracious readers, right? So I grew up with the autobiography of Malcolm X, grew up with Toni Morrison's work. There was no distinction, right? Grew up with Essence magazine. I grew up in New York City. And so for me, it wasn't like a categorization of groups, right? Okay, well, this is Dominican and this is Cuban and this is African American. Like my neighbor on one side was Jewish, my other neighbor was from New Orleans, the other neighbor down the block, like across the hall, because I grew up in a large apartment complex, was from South Carolina. My Jewish godfather, best friend of my father, married two Black women, one from Brooklyn, the other from South Carolina. So for me, this was very much, it didn't feel like I'm entering into unknown territory. When I was, so I grew up knowing about Black history, reading Black history, learning Black history. I was, 13 when Spike Lee's, Malcolm X movie came out. I knew about Spike. We watched Black films. This is not different. And then when I went to college, I was an English major and, learned about Chaucer and Milton and all the things. But then I also I very much felt at home in African-American literature, right? And so that's where I really started learning chronologically about the history of Black writing in this country, right? So Phyllis Wheatley, and all the folks, Ralph Ellison, again, Morrison, Richard Wright. And then I learned about Latino studies. And that was the switch in my path because at the time, I I was also college is a very interesting process of identity figuring out ing,
Yes.
if that's the technical term. And where I went to college, it was the first time I was outside of New York City. And so it was the first time that I encountered the discipline that we as people of color impose on each other and on ourselves. And so I'm encountering, Black folks who are deciding who is Black enough and who's not. Latinos who are deciding who is not Latino, like I'd never encountered that, right? So within the Puerto Rican like I grew up in New York where my identifying factor was like I was raised in the Northwest Bronx. Like, and depending on my audience, I could say near Clinton High School, and for another audience, I could say Bronx Science, but they knew exactly where I'm talking about. And my best friends, we identified not as like, oh, she's Bayesian, she's Chinese American, she's Ecuadorian, but she's in Corona, she's in Astoria. Like, that's how we identified each other. And so those were our distinguishing factors more than, you know, ethnicity and nationality. And so going to college where all of a sudden I was seeing that and feeling that, right? These tensions within a Puerto Rican community. Like I check off a box of where I'm from, and all of a sudden the institution decides who I am, right?
Mhm.
Oh, you checked off Puerto Rican? That means you're going to be a part of our diversity summer program, which is really about acclimating you to the correct English that you should be writing. And me and my snobby ass at 17 was like, I just got a 5 on AP English. How dare you assume that I need, you know what I mean? Like, it was just things
Mhm.
like that, like, I thank my parents for allowing me to have a sense of self such that I could be that snotty and just be like, I'm not going to that. But it was an introduction to how people outside thought without, like, just based off the boxes checked rather than getting to know me as a person. And that continued to be the conversation, like what I learned, right? So my friends were the ragtag folks who were, either New Euricans who were apparently too Black for other Puerto Ricans or other New Euricans, um, Black folks who were too Black because they were coming from a working class background for the African American elite, Chicanas who were not Chicana enough. Like that's who we were. We were the like, oh, we don't fit these boxes. Cool. And in the midst of that, I had never heard of something like Latino studies. I didn't know what that was.
Mhm.
And that was the first time I learned about Puerto Rican studies. That's the first time I learned about the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. That's the first time I learned about Black people identifying, Black Latin Americans and Black New Yorkers identifying as such. And I grew up in a household where, we weren't trying to be white. That was not desirable. We weren't staying out of the sun. If anything, we're like, oh, let's see what kind of tan we gonna get. Like, so again, that was when like upon learning about Black folks in Spanish-speaking countries who unequivocally were saying, yeah, yo soy negro, yo soy negra. Yeah, there was no hiding behind a national identity. There was no rejection of Blackness. In fact, there was an assertion of Black pride. That was like, whoa, wait a minute, what is this? And let me learn more about it. And that was my entrance formally into Black studies. That was when I learned about the College Language Association and the CLA Journal and Kalalu and all of these structures that generations of academics before me, primarily African American academics, had built for us. And then that professor, William Luis, who was visiting my college that year and who remains at Vanderbilt University, when I said, I want to learn more about this, he invited me to learn more about that and said, you should study for a PhD. And I said, who's going for a PhD? I'm so sorry. Like, I was so like disrupted at like being in college. Like, I finished college in 3 years with my degree because I needed to go. And then I just kept learning. I kept learning about us, and I remember I was formerly a Latin Americanist. So I was admitted into a Spanish and Portuguese department. My thought was I was going to get a master's in Spanish and go to law school because I'm an English major. So, like, we all go to law school. Like, who's doing this? And like, that was the plan. But then because I wanted to study the Caribbean, they said, "You're a Latin Americanist." I said, "Okay, sure." Again, in my head, 2 years, I'm going. And they said, "You have to study Brazil." And I was like, "Okay," knowing nothing, nothing about me. And I took the Portuguese class. First time I took it, the professor was there was no interaction with the students. It was all about being technically proficient, and so I was like, "Yeah, I'm not doing that." And then the following year, they got a new professor, and she was from Rio de Janeiro, and she was talking Portuguese. And that first day, anyone who studied language, maybe part of your audience remembers those classes where there were either ones that were just repeat what's on the page and that kind of idea. And then there's some that are immersive, right? Like
Mhm.
from the first moment, they're like, "Bom dia, como vai tudo, classe? Estamos aqui." And I heard that woman's accent from Rio de Janeiro. And she was like, "Eu sou carioca," and, like, very, like, open mouth, like, so we could understand it,
Mhm.
particularly because we were Spanish. Many of us were exposed to Spanish, and I say that because I was not a native Spanish speaker either. We did not speak Spanish in my home. My parents spoke Spanish to gossip and to talk about bills. That was a secret adult language. I was nosy, and I heard it, and I understood it, but the actual production of Spanish didn't start until I was in that Spanish PhD program. I took Spanish in high school as a requirement. I took Spanish in college as a requirement, but I'm in a Spanish PhD program in Spanish classes. Ha ha! Writing really bad papers. And that Portuguese class changed my life because that woman's Brazilian accent sounded like my family's Puerto Rican Caribbean Spanish. And I said, "What do these places have in common?" And that's when what I quickly realized was Black people. That's what they have in common. And so from that moment, every paper I turned in was about Black people, Black identity. I took a linguistics class. I was talking about African retentions and influence on the language. I took you know, uh, uh, what is it? Early modern Spanish drama class. And I was writing about Sor Juana and her representation of Afro Spanish people in the 17th century. Like everything was about Black people at that point. And so that was it, man. That was the turn. The turn was recognizing if I, who at 17, again, in my arrogance, 18, 19, I was astounded by the erasure, and particularly the erasure of Black history within Latin America and the Caribbean. Because why is it that I'm discovering, and I say that, how is it that I can be fluent in like knowing about whatever, like, Chaucer and John Milton, and I know nothing about my own people? And I know nothing about, at that point, at least 200-year-old canon, right, of writing, right? So that's what sparked my inquiry to learn more about it because I was like, I don't know how I'm gonna do this. At 19, I vowed to disseminate this literature in some way, shape, or form. That was the prayer that I led up at 19. And I'm 47 now, God willing, turning 48 this year, and I'm still doing it because that was the vow. That's the pledge, is learning in my, like, just really coming to understand, like, how many people don't know that there are Spanish-speaking people who identify as Black around the world, Portuguese-speaking people who identify as Black, right? When we think about Blackness many times, certainly in the United States, you'll extend it, like, for French-speaking, right? Like, you'll go, "Okay, well, Haiti is right there, so yes," right? Or, even if you, like, follow soccer, right? Like, you've seen, like, the African countries, so you're like, "Okay, that's fine." But Spanish and Portuguese, that has been like our histories, even within our own countries, have been subsumed. And so that is what drives me is to impact the development of whole fields, Afro Latin American studies, Afro Latinx studies, right? That's my Black studies. And because I wound up getting a master's in Spanish, a master's in Portuguese, and a combined doctorate in Spanish and Portuguese, and I have my English undergraduate degree, I am hemispheric, right? The moment that I learned about, like, Brazil, and I learned about and I'm like, contextualizing it within Puerto Rico, and, like, was learning about Cuba, and then but at the same time, my base is African American because that's what I know in terms of, like, okay, US Civil War, blah, 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 and I'm plugging in all of the dates and realizing, like, "Wait a minute, this is happening hemispherically. There's so much happening hemispherically." And so that's what drives me, to make a long story short.
Thank you. So we gonna follow up on that though, because so your PhD is in Spanish and Portuguese.
Yes.
Well, PhD in Spanish and Portuguese, and you focus on like the hemisphere
Yes, ma'am.
in the work that you do.
Yeah.
Um, so how do you situate yourself in relationship to the disciplines, particularly if we're thinking about like the way that like getting a PhD in a language, I'm sure is a very particular thing.
Yeah.
In terms of training and, like, how that's structured, um,
Yeah.
but the work that you do is varied and vast and draws on so many different things, so how do you situate yourself as a writer and scholar?
So I was very, very that's one thing. In my English degree, and particularly, again, William Lewis was deeply impactful, obviously, because he changed my life. Um, but the way that he did literary analysis was contextualized in history. And like the historical context was always important because the cultural products that were created in that moment was always a reflection of what was happening, right? So that's how I came to this. And I am trained with those degrees, right? So, being trained in Spanish or French is the same as being trained in English, i.e., it's literature. That's
Mhm,
what we're being trained as, right? It's not necessarily in all of those things. Like, yes, if someone gets an English degree, yeah, they have to teach composition more often than not. But then they're off into like their actual specialty, right? Spanish and Portuguese, the same thing. Like we are trained, our the equivalent of composition classes are the language classes. But ultimately, like we're teaching literature when you're teaching your specialty. For me, that basis of literature with a historical context was deeply important to me. So again, if you look at Oshun's Daughters, my first monograph, that's a book of literary analysis. Now, people look at the title and they go, "Oh, okay, this is a religion book." And it's not. It's a book about the representation of that entity of Oshun, um, in the Cuban context, if you know of syncretism, that's La Virgen de la Caridad de Cobre. In Candomblé, she's Oshun. In Nigeria, she's Oshun, right? This is the entity of the Yoruba peoples, right? Um, but I'm not talking about her. I'm talking about how Black women across this hemisphere were pulling on her, invoking her in their poetry and in their novels, right? I begin with Audre Lorde in 1969, and I go through novels until 2001. And so that for me, it's about I try for every single book that I write or I'm a part of, I try for it to be a buffet, but not but, and after Oshun's Daughters is when I wrote about Mr. Schomburg. And again, Arturo Schomburg has changed my life because I started writing that book knowing that few people knew about him. They know about maybe the Schomburg Center. They know that, but then again, there are some people who are like, I just thought that was a Jewish man. I didn't know that that was a Black man. And they definitely didn't know he was a Black Puerto Rican man whose mother was from St. Croix. So that was where my research starts kicking in. So I started that book again with very aware that I'm not trained as a historian, but also knowing, oh my God, I'm probably going to write a history book. like, so for me, I started with with his writings, because most people don't know he wrote, right? They just, oh yeah, the guy with the books. He wrote articles. So I started there, right? And then what became very clear was even in that book, okay, his life is fascinating, right? He is born a year after slavery is ended in Puerto Rico. People don't know there was slavery in Puerto Rico, right? And there was a gradual abolition. So the law was passed in 1873. He is born in 1874. People actually finished enslavement in 1876. So we go, okay, his birth date. Then I learned, oh, okay, he's comes to New York at 17 in 1891, right? So what happens is I go birth date, death date, and I start filling the blank. So that, again, the essential, like, here are the dates I know. Let me put that in context. And then here are other dates. It's a deeply comparative process. What's happening historically in this moment, in this moment, in this moment, across the hemisphere. And with that book, I became deeply, deeply involved in history. And I say that I have a touch of Schomburgitis in Spanish, or Schomburgitis, because ever since then, I'm in the archive. So every subsequent book, I'm in the archive, whether it's about him or just historical moments. Um, and so that's how again, it is reflective of the interdisciplinarity of Black studies, right? We're never just one thing.
Thank you. So, given that, right, I want to ask a little bit more about the work that you do, right?
Mhm.
So, you talked a little bit about some of the scholarship that you've done, not all of it. You can talk about your other books too. But the work you do on the series,
Yeah.
the work you do as an advisory board member, like how does Black studies play into that work as well?
Yeah. So when I was in graduate school, again, I really want to emphasize this. I was not someone who dreamt of being a professor. I'm a first generation college student, right? Who thankfully grew up to parents who did not finish college. My mother started college and then she got married, as was part of her generation in the 60s. My father went to vocational school in high school. He grew up, a Puerto Rican in New York in the 1940s, where while a guidance counselor recognized his brilliance, he couldn't go to college. Like, he was the first in his family. He was supporting his family. He was the oldest of five. So these are people who, again, while they didn't have the formal opportunity, and this is before like loans, federal loans and all the things, they gave that to us. And so that's what we did. But, again, my dream was not, I'm going to be a professor. That's like far beyond, right? What I knew was like, I'm going to college, I'm going to get this degree. And so every year I was in graduate school, what drew me was the learning. And then there came a point where I was like, "Oh, dip, I might this might happen. Wait a minute." Like, and I thought of it that way, "This might happen," not "I might do this," because there's a change in that agency. Um, and so I started learning as much as I could, and one of the things was like, okay, in the academy, what's legible is research, right? Is publications. And so Earl Fitz, with whom I co-edited the book we wrote in 2024, the volume we wrote on Machado de Assis, Blackness in the Americas, who has been a mentor, and he was the person I realize now when I was in graduate school that entering that he was like, you have to learn about Brazil. He was the person who had actually created that combined PhD program. He was the Brazilianist in the department. I didn't know that at the time. It's just somebody telling me I have to take a class. All right, whatever. And he was also the person who, when I took my first class with him, which was called Comparative Methodologies, he told me the academy needed my voice, which is an incredibly powerful thing to tell somebody. I didn't know what academy he was talking about. I know what he was talking about. But again, in the same way I trusted William Lewis when he was like, "You should go study for a PhD." I trusted this man. A few years later, he said, for graduate students, the first easiest ways to start getting published is to write book reviews for the journals of our professional associations. And so he said, just write to them. So at the time, again, I was training to be a Spanish and Portuguese professor. So there's the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese. Their journal's called Hispania. Write to them. I wrote to American Studies. I wrote to like a few journals, CLA Journal, right? I wasn't published there, but Melis, right? I was published there. American Studies. Just write to them and say, here's who I am, 1-page CV, and see if they have any books, for review. Now, what I didn't know was journals always have books for review. And so I quickly, at least with Hispania, right? I quickly started review. It wound up that I started reviewing every book that came out on Afro Latin American studies. I reviewed, or at least that's how it felt, right? And so that's how both I'm learning about what's in the field, and I continue, right, just writing and then getting these lines. And so then that starts, right? And I see how people are writing for journals. And then, I publish an article in CLA Journal, right? And another article in the publication of the Afro Latin American Association, Palara, which is the journal of Alara, which is the association. And so all of those things, they all start feeding into each other. They're all rivers feeding into each other. As a When I was writing the book on Mr. Schomburg, I was at Columbia University with, uh, at the time, Kayama Glover was at Barnard, Kelly Josephs was there. They were working on small acts, right? And I didn't know about small acts and David Scott's journal. And Kelly did the digital organ of it, which is SX Salon. And she was sitting there going, "Gosh, I wish I had a book review editor." And I was like, "I'll do that. I love me some books. I do that." And she was like, "For real?" And I said, and so that journal up until that point was specifically focused on Anglophone Caribbean. And I said, "I will do it on one condition. It needs to reflect the entirety of the Caribbean." And so again, for me, because I had had formative experiences. In college, I would go to something that said it was a Caribbean event, and I see nothing about one side of it or the other. So either it was a specifically like Anglophone event, or it was just Puerto Rican and Cuban and Dominican, and so we're going to leave out the Francophone and the like it was following dictates of empire. And so I was like, no, we need the entirety of the Caribbean represented. The other thing was I had already noticed by that, again, in college, that when people use the word African diaspora, they left out Spanish and Portuguese speaking peoples often, right? Anglophone and French is really the languages, which is why my first two books were based on a conference that I had done, and deliberately I'm using the word African diaspora because I'm attempting to, again, do a holistic, get people to understand, like, or at least recognize in like front of mind kind of way, oh, wait a minute, we are multilingual, all of us who are peoples of African descent. And so, yeah, they all feed it. So then, like, I started doing the book I was the book review editor, and then I have a chance to put other people on, right? So there are people whose whose first publications were reviews for that, right? Okay, and so I don't realize between people getting used to reading my reviews in Hispania, that means that people are getting to at least learning my name, right? They're recognizing my name. So that when my books come out, then they start being reviewed, and people go, "Oh, right, Vanessa, I remember her. She'd been doing this," right? And then with Essex Salon, I was also able to develop, uh so I developed pipelines. And so what I mean by that is we publish 4 reviews, maybe 1,000 words. Well, I don't like, that a certain date would come up, and it'd be like, "Oh, we have nothing." That would never happen with me. I will be like, "I got 15 of these, and, like, what do you need?" Let's figure it out. And so what that would mean is, like, sometimes we had all review, like, issues, right? And again, this is all digital, so but that meant that, like, I then was editing, like, a whole thing, right?
Mhm.
And then that means that when I'm doing edited volumes, it feeds into that, right? And so by the time I'm invited to join Small Acts, again, the writ large, that journal that under which SX Salon is, I'm already very familiar with how they work. right? And so when I'm invited to do the Callaloo Advisory Board, right? I'm a fan of Callaloo for years as a journal, and so, like, I know how they work. Um, and with the success of Diasporic Blackness, it's only while I was writing Diasporic Blackness, I'm looking at, the field. Again, I'm looking at publishing companies, many of which I know of because I'm reviewing books, and certainly as
Mhm.
a book review editor, I'm getting advanced readers' copies of books around, all different publishers, and I'm going, nobody not nobody, very few focused on Afro-Latin American studies, like less than 5, right? Like, at the time, right? And so Caribbean studies, yes, but that also is a holistic Caribbean, depending, but not Black Latin America, not Black, Afro Latinx, Afro Latin America. And so while I was writing the Schomburg book, I know what the Schomburg book is going to do. I can feel it because I know the hunger about wanting to learn about that man.
Mhm.
And so I proposed a series to 2 people, and both of them were like, and I was like, oh, all right. And then Diasporic Blackness comes out. And then it comes in 2017, and then it comes out in paperback in 2018. And then I could pitch, like, so the Schomburg Center has an annual, they celebrate his birthday on January 24th. And so I could say, "Hey, I have a book and it's 24.95, and it's the second book on him. The first one was published in 1989. Would you be interested in having this event?" And so I have a book launch at the Schomburg Center. And, like, again, I'm so thankful for him, um, because with the success of that, I had a new editor at SUNY Press. I'd already published, Let Spirit Speak, my first book, and my first monograph with SUNY Press, and I was already kinda like, I don't." But the new acquisition editor comes of her own accord down from Albany, where offices are. She's tweeting about Diasporic Blackness. She's taking pictures. And her name is Rebecca Colesworthy, and I was like, "Who's this energy?" Because I've never met an acquisitions editor like this, right? That was like, she has energy for, like, my book, and it wasn't even her project. And so I loved her energy, and I was like, if you're ever in the mood to, like, do a series on Afro-Latin American studies and Afro-Latinx studies, and she was like, "Yep, yes, I would be." And that was it. And so again, that for me taught me a couple things, one of which is wait for the yes. Not
Mhm.
the, like, you have to convince and you have to, like, cajole and, like, they're like, "Yeah, I get." No, the full, like, wholehearted, full chest yes. No questions asked. Such a powerful moment for me. And the second thing, what I realized about myself is sometimes I know things, like, I might know it intuitively, i.e., "Hey, this book is gonna do some things," but there are people who need the evidence of it. They need
Mhm.
to see it already happening. And so I've had to learn to just, like, okay, keep quiet, wait for it to come out, have the reaction, then I have the empirical evidence, like, "You see?" And so and, yeah, so then I have a series called Afro Latinx Futures with, our 16th book is coming out this July, and that's about it centers Blackness, Black peoples, and Black intellectual contributions to all of our countries. It's humanities and social sciences based. And so, we're publishing things like, to this point, we started publishing, like, one of our first books was on, like, an anthropology book, about on Santo Domingo. Like, we actually had a double first book. We had Nathan Dies's translation, of The Immortals, which is a poetry book by a Haitian poet, and we had the Santo Domingo book. So those we had, like, a double birth, in November 2020. But we've published books about the Dominican Republic and Haiti and Brazil and Puerto Rico and Central America, and it's all Black people because, again, people are very content to think of Black folks in all of our countries as, okay, sports figures and entertainers, sure. Like, that's where they're relegated to. But when we think about Black intellectual production, like Black creativity, right? I mean, there's few places outside of the United States, and certainly throughout Latin America, it's not like there's a Black studies curriculum, with the exception of Brazil, right?
Mhm.
Possibly IT, and I would say IT, but again, like IT has that, Brazil has that, but like there are lots of places where like colonialism is real and whitewashing is real, right? And so Nathan, with his translation of the Immortals, he had pitched that translation. And I hadn't, and I was like, duh, of course translation to be a part of this series. Because I was like, no, humanities and social sciences, and monographs and edited volumes. And then for a little bit, I had worked with Jonna Moser, who's the director of Vanderbilt University Press. Previously, she was at Northwestern University Press. And I really loved working with her. I had read a manuscript for her. And I talked to her once. I said, I don't know what I want to do. I want to do something with you. I don't know what. Just again, because by this point now I'm on vibes. Now I just want to work with people that like we get along well. Like we can build together. Um and Jana moved to by then she was at Vanderbilt. And again, so the alma mater press, right? And she says, "What do you think about the translation series?" And I was like, "Ooh, yes!" Right? And so again, what we know to be true, first of all, Spanish and Portuguese in general is some of the lowest, least translated work. Black literature from around the world is some of the least translated work. And
Mhm.
so again, spark. Yes, right there. Yes, we're going to do this. And she said, "Well, you represent this languages, can we get some other people to fill this out?" Right? And of course, now, yeah, I've already worked with Nathan. Nathan's my friend, and so I immediately think of Nathan because of his work not only as a scholar but primarily as a translator. And Nathan's on board. Boom. And then the thought was like, hey, what if we get like three Vanderbilt University graduates, right, PhDs, and then we both knew Annette, and so we reached out to Annette. Annette was like, okay. And so this is our adventure. And so now we signed on with that series in 2024. Our first books came out in 25, like in like literally like summer 25. And if you look on the Vanderbilt University Press website for global Black writers in translation, like we have 3 books that are already out. We have another 5 coming into like November 2026. And so we're doing that, right? Like, it's just like, and again, like we have like a novel from poetry from IT, and a novel from Martinique, and a novel from Guadeloupe, and a novel from Puerto Rico, and a novel from poems from like in Swahili from like 18th century, and you know a poetry collection from this Afro-Dominican man. And again, everyone that's writing are identify as Black, right? So Black Puerto Rican, Black Dominican, right? Like Martinique, Guadeloupe, like all of the things. And it's again making sure that this work is answering an English speaking audience to know, like, hey, we out here, right? And God willing, we've reached out to, someone who translates like a Black Hungarian work, and Black Swedish work, and Black Persian work, and like it's all out there. And so that again, my life is about rivers, like the streams turning into the rivers, turning into the ocean. They're all connected. Again, to make a long story short, obviously.
No, thank you. That I really appreciated that, and I think, like, the metaphor of the streams to rivers to oceans, like, no, that's perfect. And it does, like, everything is connected, it makes perfect sense. Um, so thank you for
Mm,
elaborating on that. I know I've gotten to talk to Dr. Joseph Gabriel, Dr. Dice lately, so the the translation piece
mhm,
is so interesting to me. Um, I had there's a one of the institutions that I worked at, one of their first year books had a translator's note in it because it was initially in Spanish and it was translated to English, and we made that the first year book. And it was a good book, but I always taught the translator's note because, like, I think it's so important for students to think of, like, when you're this is not a you can't just word to word translate something, like, that's not how it works. So
mhm,
really thinking about, as you said in the beginning, the context within which things are happening, and having that there, um, is so important, and I think a really good practice or, like, strategy for students to think about, even in their own works. Like, you're talking even if you're talking about something contemporarily, you're not talking in a vacuum. There are all these
Right,
things, especially right now, happening that, like, you have to consider in
right.
the arguments that you're making, um, and I think translation just makes that so clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's so, like, as Black people, it's like so people sometimes, not scholars, but just in general, one of the things I would pose to my students, right, is, first of all, the only place that wanted us, that wanted to claim us as citizens was Haiti. Like, let's be very clear on this. Like, no country wanted us, and certainly not in this hemisphere, right? And so when I would encounter folks outside of the classroom in particular who would be like, that node of, I'm not Black, I'm fill in the nation, right?
Mhm,
What I know to be true, first of all, is nationalism has a pull. It's a very real thing. But when I was in the classroom, I would remind them of Haiti, and then I would say we would start talking about, like, how people moved, right? Like, enslavement in this hemisphere was a multinational empire, right? And so the folks who designed it were all from different countries, and guess what? The nations that they were pulling from on the African continent, they were all different. Like, that was a deliberate thing, right? And the mixing of us as peoples. And so, just even getting them, I remember the first time a student of mine sat back and said, "We had specialties?" I said, "Yeah, like, certain nations were known for, like, what they could do. These are the folks who were rice growers. These are the folks, who were known to, like, make tools, or who were
mhm,
goldsmiths, or who were, like, all of these things." And, like, she was astounded because she was like, "Why didn't they fight back?" And I was like, "Baby, they did fight back." Like, and so even that, right, coming to thing that I valued in the classroom was being able to air out those kinds of pains, because that's what they are, right? Those kinds of pains. So I recognize in New York City, even in New York City, like, people kind of squint at me because they don't know visually what I am. Like, they can't really tell, right? They're like, some kind of Black, right? But I did my PhD in Nashville, Tennessee. And in Nashville, Tennessee at the time, certainly from, 2000 to 2007, while there was a growing Mexican population that happened there, it's Black and white. It's the US South, right? I'm down the road from Fisk University, down the block from Tennessee State, right? I was a light-skinned Black woman in the South. And here's the reality. Racially, I'm a light-skinned Black woman, right? Yeah, that's detail is real, but that's who I am, right? And then even within Puerto Ricans, I'm a light-skinned Black woman. There's no confusion about who I am. None. And, some of the harshest racism I found was from white, male, conservative Puerto Ricans, right? Who were very reflective of their field. The Spanish studies as a field, Latin American studies as a field is incredibly conservative, as is French, as is, like, all of these things, like, as are the disciplines, right? Gatekeeping, it was real, is real. And so once I got on, I felt like it was my responsibility, right, to try to put on as many people as possible. My dream in graduate school was, if this happens, and again, if this happens, not if I do this, if this happens, that I finish this PhD, that I get a tenure track job by the grace of God, I believe in, like, oh no, we're going to open it up as much as possible, because I didn't dream of, I'm going to change the academy. My dream was, how can I make this a place? How can I cultivate relationships with people with whom I can build? How can it be a little bit more kind, or a little bit more, right?
mhm,
And you know, I also, at a very critical time in my early 20s, when I was in grad school I started when I was 20 years old. I turned 21. I ended when I was 28. So my 20s was in graduate school. So I'm reading Bell Hooks. I read Bell Hooks's Remembered Rapture. That collection is one where a good number of those essays, she's eulogizing Black feminists who had died prematurely. And the lesson for me from that was I am not giving my health to this thing. F that. Like, yes, the learning and yes, the work, but I ain't sacrificing myself to this because this thing was not built for me. It doesn't support me. Right. But I'm learning, I'm reading Toni Morrison and, like The Role of the Ancestor, that essay and all of her work. Right. I'm reading the Combahee River Collective. When I read that, I started crying so much because they talk about smart Black girls and how they're rejected and how they're considered undesirable. And I started weeping, thinking about you know, that switch when I was in school, when I became an adolescent, and how, like, everybody knew I was a bookworm. But man, when hormones hit, people were very quick to be all like, ugh, gross, right? And my seventh grade, eighth grade self, all of those things, right? We get to learn, we get to teach, we get to hold each other closely, right? And so, yeah, the fact that our experiences are not dictated by empire, right? Remember learning about, like, the West Indians who built the Panama Canal, right? Marcus Garvey traveling to Panama and Costa Rica. Marcus, even learning that Marcus Garvey was Jamaican, right? Before it was Jamaica as a free country. Learning that Langston Hughes had translated, Nicolas Guillen from Cuba, had translated Aimé Césaire, I'm sorry, Jacques Romain from Haiti, right? Like, those are our relationships, right? We cross, right? Like, we cross all these linguistic boundaries, often for work, right? There's the whole third of Haiti. I'm sorry, the whole third of Cuba, Oriente. Oriente has a significant population of Cubans of Haitian descent because they were coming to cut the cane in Cuba, right?
Mhm.
So there's all of these stories. And so even when I was in college, as I was filling in the gaps, that was also the impulse. Like, we gotta fill in all of these stories. Like, I'm always fascinated by people by us being in places that we're not apparently, quote, unquote, "supposed to be." And really what I mean is, like, anything that stereotypes us, any box. Okay, you fit here. And lived experience is like, "Nah, I'm in 15 places. I do all of these things. I'm not the only academic." God knows. You know how many Black women I know who do 5, 6, 7 things, right? Like, that's just what we do, you know? And so for me, it's not, like, out of the realm of extraordinary. And again, I thank my parents and I thank my godmother, who's like my second mother to me, because all of these people, they always told me, like, "Yeah, keep going. Yeah, don't stop right there. Yeah, you can do this." And so we are so much more, all of us, we are so much more than we think we are. And so for me, it's the joy of learning. It's the joy of, like, always staying in the space of being a student. Like,
Mhm.
I'm on a podcast of scholars, right? And people ask, like, "What's your expertise?" And I like, for me, that's such a trap. I am an expert in, like, ugh, because for me, it, like, that feels like clamps. That feels like,
Mhm.
oh, you're trying to like categorize me in something, right? And that goes, like, for me, every book I write, all of these projects, I have to be in the space of student. When I'm in the classroom, I tell my students, I said, "I'm not the font of knowledge, and y'all not gonna get an A by repeating what I said. Like, that's ridiculous. My ego doesn't demand it. It's gross. It is a nasty exercise to me." I said, "What I am is a guide for all of you for the next 16 weeks. And we're gonna figure this out together. And we're gonna learn some things. And I'm gonna learn as much from you as you're gonna learn from me. And you're gonna learn from each other." And
Mhm.
that's kind of my ethos in all the things that I do.
Well, thank you. I want to build on that and ask about the forthcoming book on the Schomburg.
So this year, so in May 2020, I'm sorry, in May 1925, the 135th Street Branch Library inaugurated something called the Division of Negro History, Literature, and Prints. So the 135th Street Branch, just a branch library of the New York Public Library. And it's located on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. And at the time, Harlem was Harlem. This is Harlem Renaissance Harlem. Um, and so that was the meeting space, right? For all of these everything that was related to like Black New York City, like cutting edge stuff, right? It's happening there, right? And so this was the head librarian at the time, Ernestine Rose, who was a white woman. She believed that the branch library should serve it's the demographics of its neighborhood, right? The public library has to serve the neighborhood. And so she hired some of the first Black librarians, right, in the system. Catherine Latimer was there. Regina Andrews Anderson was there. Pura Belpré was there, first Afro-Puerto Rican woman as a librarian. And Arturo Schomburg had been volunteering at that library by that point for like 2 decades. And so any book that they had about Black folks was quickly sold out, right? Like it was being exhausted. And so they said, okay, they made the decision to have something specifically about uh, Black literature, Black history imprints. A year later, Arturo Schomburg, then known commonly as Arthur Schomburg, everybody knew about his private collection, right? Like there are articles in Marcus Garvey's The Negro World of Zora Neale Hurston going out to his house in Brooklyn, Eric Walren's going out to his house in Brooklyn, and meeting him and seeing his collection. James Weldon Johnson used his collection to produce the anthology, the poetry anthology that he edited. Right, so very, very common. Everybody knows about this, and in fact, by that point, his wife had said, "We have to do something about this. Like, we have to secure, like, what's gonna happen with all of these books." And so with the help of the National Urban League and the NAACP, they went to so he's working with, Arthur Schomburg was now the man who graduated with a college degree, but he's surrounded by the PhDs, right?
Mm.
Du Bois is one of the first people to be publishing him. He has articles in The Crisis. Charles S. Johnson, who is the editor of Opportunity, who then later goes to Fisk and becomes like the president of Fisk University, right? That's his friend. That's his boy, because correspondence is real, y'all. Like, you see all the tea in correspondence. Um, so, like, he invites him to be at Fisk for 3 years. And so he's surrounded by PhDs. And so they all are urging him not only to write a book, which is funny because that's not common anymore, but also to like, they want to make sure that his collection goes somewhere. And so they go to the Carnegie Corporation. The Carnegie Corporation buys his work for $10,000, which today is almost $200,000, and they make sure it goes to the New York Public Library. And so that's May 1926. And so 2025 to 2026, the Schomburg Center is celebrating its centennial. The thing is, there had never been a published bibliography of all the things Mr. Schomburg actually donated. So since 1926, Mr. Schomburg died in 1938. There had never been a rendering, even within the NYPL, of like, what did he donate? What were his books, right? And so the book that is coming out in this April, called Black Studies on 135th Street, um, it's the first time that his bibliography, that the actual, at least for the books, right? There's an accounting of all of the books. As many, I think it's up to 90% of it's a exercise in literary archaeology that my colleagues, in particular Barry Brown, who is the curator of manuscripts, archives, and rare books at the Schomburg, and Laura Helton, who is a professor at the University of Delaware, there was this team, the Schomburg got Mellon funding, and while Kevin Young was the director, and that was the beginning of the process of, like, actually accounting for what were the books that were under his possession. And so so 2/3 of the book is, like, the bibliography, so we get to see what Mr. Schomburg collected, how he put them together. Here in New York City, our new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, was sworn in using a Quran that was a Quran from his family, but on top of it was a small Quran that was from the Schomburg collection.
Oh,
Right?
wow.
Right, and so people were like, "Where did this come from? What do you mean?" And it was I think there's, something inside of it. I don't remember if it was the book. There's a book plate showing that it was from Mr. Schomburg's private collection, but then people are like, "Was he Muslim? Blah, blah, blah." And it's like, no, he collected, again, from the entirety of our experience as Black peoples, as peoples of African descent on this earth. And so just things like that, right? Again, you initially asked me like what drives me, right? And what continues, what's the holes? And I'm like, there's so much that we don't know about our own histories across languages and across empires. And that's what drives me. It's things like that. It's like the wait, how did that who? And so a third of the book is, essays. We asked scholars we shared with scholars the lists of books and and there's everyone they have different specialties, but then they could see like, "Oh, wait, he had this stuff," right? And so it's reflections on what he had and then what the impact is of the next 100 years of Black studies.
Thank you. That's
Mhm.
really exciting. Like, that wild that the bibliography had never been, like, published. That's wild. But that's also I think that's gonna be so it provides so much possibility
Yes.
and the opportunity to think about, like, things differently, like, how okay, he collected all of these things, but let's think about, like, these texts in conversation with each other and these and what that says about a particular thing, like, that's really exciting, so thank you for sh
Yeah, no, I mean, again, we're really excited for it to come out again. It comes out April 21st, and, um, we're excited because, again, like many things related to Mr. Schomburg, just people don't know. So, like, okay, he had this library. So the perception of the Schomburg Center, for example, is, oh, it's a Black archive, it's the premier Black archive, therefore it's African American. And so people don't know, like, no, actually, there's stuff from the African continent. There's stuff in like indigenous African languages that are waiting to be translated there, right? There are 11 million items at the Schomburg Center. So if you want anything related to Black people anywhere, anytime, it is at the Schomburg Center. Now, it may not come up on first blush, like when you like enter a simple search. So I urge anyone, please talk to the folks there, right? Or like because there are so many people that don't know. In the way that they didn't know that he was Puerto Rican, they don't know that there's like a vast Latin American holdings there, right? Like I would bring my students from my Afro Latin American classes and like I would ask the curator of photography and prints, like, could you just pull? And, like, they were like, "Oh, yeah, sure. Here are, pictures of Black folks from Ecuador, Black folks from Brazil, like," and my students are looking like, "What are we talking about?" And I was like, "Right, because 'cause we've been here for a very long time," and so, yeah, again, like, just with that book, I love that you just made that connection of like, oh, there are things that there's so much about him. We can't make conclusions because like we didn't know. And
Mhm.
that's all it is. And so, I loved when I was working on this is gonna sound bad, but I'm gonna say it because it's true to my experience. When I was working on the exhibition with the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Juan de Pareja, Afro-Hispanic Painter, right? That was an exhibition about a 17th century Afro-Spanish man who had been owned by Diego Velázquez, who is known as one of the great painters of early modern Spain. People don't know that there was slavery in Spain on the actual peninsula, right? Spanish people don't know. Like we were interviewed by journalists and they wrote about this, some wrote about this exhibition as, oh, well, this is a very American obsession with race, right? And partly it was again because they were like, who are you to be you who are us as like David and myself, the co-curator, David Pullins and myself, we are, US people, right? Like, and I say US instead of American because American equals the entirety. Like Latin Americans look at us like, hello. Canadians look at us like, huh, us too. But like And I was talking to them and I would say, "This is your history." Now, instead of asking why the Met is doing this, how about asking why isn't Spain? Why isn't this traveling to the Prado?
Mm.
Why don't you know this history? This is your history. This is like 17th century history. This is, like black people, when we think about like, again, when people think sometimes about like black folks in Europe, they think about the immigration crisis and they think about folks fleeing the continent to try to get there. They don't think about hundreds of years of black peoples on the European continent.
Mhm.
And so when we were having those discussions, right? Again, the reason that David asked me to co-curate was Juan de Pareja as a painter, as a man, was very well known in the 17th century, and the 18th century, the 19th century, and then it drops off. Writing about him drops off. And the only person writing about him was Arturo Schomburg. And he was writing about him in The Crisis and in Opportunity and in Ebony and Topaz, which was a journal, a one-issue journal that was edited by Charles S. Johnson, right? So he was like, who's this Arthur Schomburg person? And so like Google and Vanessa and the book, and here I am. And so when after our initial conversation, he was like, do you want to co-curate this with me? And I'm like, yeah. Do I want my first exhibition to be at the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Yes, sir. Yes, I do.
Yeah. 'Cause
And
let me think about that real quick. Like,
I don't
can I get back to you?
like exactly. Like, I don't know, like, can I get 2 weeks? Right. And so even that, right? Like, here is one like here's a man that people associate with a building, and people don't know, first of all, they don't know, like, the extent of the holdings in that building. They know very little about him, right? And so, I just I don't when I wrote Diasporic Blackness, my intention was not to be the expert on Mr. Schomburg. My intention was, I'll write this, and I wanted to put meat on his bones and invite people to learn more about him, and go ahead. Like, and then what winds up happening, thankfully, is then I get all these opportunities, right, to talk more about him. And then the Met calls. And then, they were working with Ballet Hispanico. And then I talked to the director of Ballet Hispanico, and then they develop a dance based on the exhibition. And then, like, Lincoln Center calls because they're doing something on San Juan Hill, which was a black community that was destroyed, right, in the 1950s. By the 1950s, it was known as a predominantly Puerto Rican community, but Arturo Schomburg lived there in the 1890s, so I say the Puerto Ricans were there way before the 1950s. It's just that they were Black Puerto Ricans, so y'all don't really think about it that way, but that was the area that was destroyed to create Lincoln Center, that is portrayed in West Side Story, right? And so they called because other people were talking about Arthur Schomburg, and then they were like, "We're so sorry. This man has come up 3 times, and, we didn't know of your work, but now we do." And I'm like, "Hi, welcome to the party." And so, again, like, what winds up happening is I'm very happy for the invitations. I get to talk about him, I get to talk about the center, right? And I invite people, if you do not know about the Schomburg Center, please visit nypl.org/Schomburg. Please Google, please, please, please,
And
anything related, again, to Blackness, please, like, just go reach out and find out about them. They have so much. They have 5 divisions. They have a division on moving image and sound, and on they have a art and artifact division. They have, photography and prints. They have the manuscripts, archives, and rare books, and then they have their research and reference. So, literally, anything you want is at the Schomburg Center.
yes, thank you. So, I wanna be respectful of your time, and I
I
feel
should
like
have been respectful of yours, right?
no, this has been amazing. You can keep talking, but I know it's a Friday.
So good.
I know people like to start their weekends.
Okay.
Um, you have a lot of what you said could answer the last 2 questions I was gonna ask you, but I wanna ask them anyway and see
Okay.
if you want to elaborate on them.
Mm.
So, what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
Oh, yes. Uh, how much we don't know,
Mm,
It really is for me, it's the questions of I was just saying this to a colleague yesterday because we were talking about slavery in Puerto Rico, and he said, "Well, that person asked these questions, and I wanna ask these questions." And I said, "Yeah, and it doesn't mean that the first one was wrong. It just means that that person's lived experience led to the questions that they
Mhm.
were asking. And maybe those questions don't jibe with our questions, and that's okay." Right? And so we just ask other questions. We ask different like, for me, the our work is never ever done. There's nothing to me that's like, "Oh, this is definitive and let's just close it. That topic is done." There's always another way of looking at things. There's always another angle, right? There's always something that, for me, what I recognize is I'm the person that Arthur Schomburg was somebody who was mostly mentioned in footnotes. If there was a chapter written about him, wonderful, or a journal, very, very few people, most often a footnote, right? And I recognize that what fascinates me are the footnotes. What
Mm.
fascinates me are the people who don't get, right, the shine. Because I go like, "Well, wait a minute," the person who's right behind the other person, right? And so many times we may think of, you know, I read about I read, Malcolm X's autobiography as many, 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 many people have, and then I wondered about Betty. And I went,
Mm.
"Well, wait a second, what is her life?" And then read, like, the fabulous biography on her, and Myrlie Evers Williams, right? And as these 2 sisters in the struggle, right? And I'm like, "Right, that." Like, for me, that's what keeps me interested. There's always more to learn. And there's always, like if there's one person who's getting the spotlight, right? Or even if there's a few who are getting the spotlight, I promise you somebody isn't. And they're still part of the scene,
Yeah.
right? And so, when we think about, like, the Pan-African Congresses that took place, that Du Bois organized, like, I think about, like, was anybody from the Spanish and Portuguese speaking lands there? Because what gets shine are, like, French and those coming from the African continent. So I'm like, "Wait, who else was there? Wait a minute. In that fair, where are these other countries? What was happening?" That's where I'm coming from. That's what keeps me motivated.
So I feel like that could also answer this last question,
All right,
which is
well, there we
what
go.
excites you about the future of Black studies, or maybe
I'm re
like go
Like,
ahead.
that's me for me personally, that's what keeps me going. I'm really excited about upcoming generations, man. I'm really excited for the work that's being done. I'm really excited for people, like, God knows we are living in a moment, man. But then the reality is, like, as Black folks, we've always been living in a moment.
Yeah.
Like, there's no moment that we're like, "Okay, we were good, everything was copacetic." Um But I'm also excited again, there are fields that are growing, and so again, like, I'm centered in things, right? I forget, for example, like, to be able to look at something like global Hispanophone studies, like, what the frig is that? Oh, because the Spanish Empire not only was in Spain, not only was Latin America, but was also Equatorial Guinea and Africa. And it was also like the fact that Morocco was a protectorate of Spain for almost a century. And it was also the Philippines and Guam. And right. So even thinking about like, yo, there are folks coming up who are looking at all of that, who are like, hey, Black studies being like really internationalized, right? Like really being like, wait a second. I have but there are things in my series in Afro Latinx Futures that they're talking about, folks who are coming from Angola, Mozambique, and they travel to Brazil, and then they come to the US, and then they go back to the African continent, right? It's kind of like, wait a minute, we don't ever think about these exchanges, right? We don't
Mhm.
think about like I'm fascinated by like, again, how people move, right? And what they learn in their movements because that's what like I was in a conversation earlier today about someone who was writing about, within a Puerto Rican context about Vieques, the island of Vieques. And the person with whom I was speaking was like, most people don't know that the history of Vieques was like prior to being part of Puerto Rico was like 200 years under the British Empire, right? Just say they don't know that Trinidad is Trinidad because that's a Spanish word, right? Jamaica is a Spanish word, right? Like Trinidad means Trinity, Jamaica means hibiscus, right? So for us who are, like that, right? That history, man. Like, so the fact that there are people who are asking questions, and again, I don't just mean like my peers are not asking these. I mean all of us. Like we're all doing our part, right? And I'm just excited for like things opening up, you know? And again, for me, what was important was the way, like the role that I could play, right? In terms of, you know, this, when I talk to potential authors about my series, both of them, all of them now, because Central, like what I offer it as is as an option. So
Mhm.
this isn't the be all and end all. I'm not the only game in town, nor do I ever want to be the only game in town, right? But there are options. And so often, one of the things that my godmother has taught me in particular, you know, there's so many people who think like we don't have options, right? In life, right? Like, so we go to graduate school thinking there's only one way to do it. And then I was very lucky to have a mother figure who, for example, I'd be like, oh, I wrote an abstract. I just wrote a chapter. I just did what, and she would always intervene and she'd be like, what do you mean? You wrote an abstract for a conference. That's huge, right? Or like, it's just a chapter for a dissertation. She's like, you mean your book? The one you're writing? That's going to be like 200 pages, that thing? And so I learned from her to always incorporate celebration, right? For every step, right? And I pass that on to as many people as possible. Like, we're doing magic, man. Come on. We're like, when you're in the classroom, you have the opportunity to introduce, to have people rethink things or think about things anew. That's an amazing place to be in, irrespective of rank, right? That has nothing to do, that work is no less important if you're contingent faculty. And it's no more important if you're the distinguished professor or the full professor. It's the same thing, right?
Mhm.
Like the very act of it. Um, when we're writing, that's what I think about the books. Like, again, nothing I write is the definitive tome on. It's an introduction, it's an invitation to, hey, maybe you didn't know this, or maybe you did know this, but maybe I'm presenting an angle from which you didn't think about it, right? Like, that's all it is. For me, it's my work is like an act of calling in, right? And all my own work, the books that I write, the books that I get to greenlight, right? Now, as the editor of at Sentinel Press, right? It's you know, Puerto Rico is a place that again it doesn't have a history of acknowledging its Black inhabitants, right? And so I'm working like I'm one person, but there are folks on the island who have been doing that work for
Mhm.
decades, right? Colectivo Ile, right? Maida Santos Febres, who is, if you have not heard of Maida Santos Febres, she is, I wouldn't even say like she's a Black Puerto Rican woman. She's not the greatest Black Puerto Rican writer. She's the greatest contemporary Puerto Rican writer and she is one of the like fantastic and wonderful. And some of her work has been published. One of her like a novel of her, a novela that she wrote. And I say novella like in the Italian way, not the Spanish way, like in the Italian way, like short novel way. Um, we're publishing in Global Black Writers in translation. That's coming out in May. Like, she was, you know, through her efforts, the University of Puerto Rico developed a curriculum of Afro-Puerto Rican studies, right, which had never been done, right? And then that's developed into a center, right, as un centro de investigación de afrodescendencia, right? Like that. So she's, again, those I pay attention to not only, yes, there are individual efforts, and then there are folks who institutionalize, right?
Mhm.
And that's what she's doing in Puerto Rico, right? Michelle Reed Vasquez, who's now at Bowdoin College. She was at the University of Pittsburgh. She, you know, she's doing that with like podcasts and like interviewing Afro-Latino, Afro-Latin American scholars and writers. And like this does that, right? This, like, so I give all credit to the folks, right? Because we're all playing our part, right? And again, obviously, when I started this conversation by saying I was very happy to talk to you, see, I wasn't playing about the like, yeah, I can go on because I get really excited about all this, man. I get excited by the work that we're all doing in the ways that we're doing. And it doesn't mean everybody has to do all the things. It means what lights you up. Identify what lights you up and follow that and see where it goes, man. And for what lights me up is the work that all of you are doing and the fact that we're all in this community and all of us, we're all each doing our parts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all that you covered. And for that, like, just the reminder that, like, you can find something that lights you up and put it out there and provide an introduction for somebody and pay attention to the footnotes and look into that thing that has not been looked into enough, because there's so much we don't know yet. And yeah, I think it's that sometimes you can forget that, especially in the moment that we're in. There's so much else going on that sometimes you can forget about the magic part.
Oh my God. Yes. And so two things about that. One is, folks talking like, is this a perilous moment? Yes. Yes, it is. Are they going to succeed in erasing us? No, they're not. So it's the reason why I don't I have no concerns about no, but what if they take this out? We here and we're building on again, hundreds of years, right? It's a very recent. Arturo Schomburg was writing about Black studies being part of the university in 1913, or gave a speech in 1903 or something like that. Years before San Francisco State and the institutionalization of Black studies. This is a very recent thing. When he was working at Fisk, right? There was no Black studies, and yet that school he was the librarian for Fisk for 2.5 years, and by the end of it, Fisk was known for its collection on Negroes from foreign lands, is how they put it, at the time, right? But it's we here, and we've been here, and our peoples have always been here. So that's one thing. Ain't nobody gonna erase us, forget us, whatever. Whatever. That's not happening. The other part of it is, man, I had a picture of me as a 6-year-old. And I was in my little strawberry shortcake nightgown, and I had a book, and I had my legs crossed, and I was reading because I was something at 6. And I think about that little girl, and me telling that little girl, you grow up to make books. What? That's amazing and wonderful. And I think so many times we do forget. And particularly, folks have asked me, given how much I've written, does it ever get old? No, obviously not, because I keep doubling down, right? But I encourage us to just stop. This is extraordinary, right? And for those of us, when I talk to undergraduate students thinking about getting a PhD, I tell them, first of all, find people who love you irrespective of your grades or accomplishments. Your identity cannot be presaged on accomplishment.
Yeah.
So first of all, find your peoples. Find the peoples that and I tell them fall in love with, if it doesn't work out, if it does work out, who cares? Live your life. Don't let this as an academy, as whatever. Jessica Marie Johnson calls it the guilds, and Annette shared that with me. Don't let the guild define you, right? Don't let any institution define you, right? And find your peoples, fall in love, live your life, find what lights you up, and hold on tight to that, man. Because, are there enough things that tell us, that try to dismiss our work? Yeah, they wouldn't be fighting so damn hard if what we do isn't so important.
Yeah.
So just we got this. God bless Gwendolyn Brooks and her ode to Paul Robeson, right? We are each other's magnitude. We are each other's bonds. Period. It's us. It's all about us. It's always been us, for us, by us. Sorry, LL Cool J, a la Fubu in the Gap commercial, but that's it. We's all we have, man. And so just act like it. That's all. Act like it.
Thank you. I think that is the perfect, act like it is the perfect thing. Thank you so, so, so much. It was
Thank
so
you.
good talking with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Hopefully, the East Coast stops freezing soon.
I saw memes that said, "See, this isn't fair. Greenland didn't do us right, and Canada didn't do us right, and dag nabbit green." We're speaking ahead of Groundhog's Day, and the groundhog better act like he know. No more 6 weeks or nothing.
But this past week was 6 weeks in and of itself. It's enough.
It's enough. We're good. It's okay. Let's bring it back. The spring is coming. Come on, let's go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You as well. Take good care.